All right, well, good afternoon, everybody. Hopefully everybody is still awake. My name is Bob Keeney, and I am one of the founders of BKeeney Software. We're located in Lenexa, Kansas, just outside of Kansas City. And this was going to be the original title for this presentation, but Xojo decided it was a little too wordy and was hard to put that all in something that was simple on the web. So we decided to cut it down just to Xojo design mistakes. But so we're going to start out with some coding mistakes. And the first one is, I have 4 projects right now that I'm trying to erase all of the go-tos. We got this from a client. And go-to is an incredibly lazy and poor way of doing coding. And in this example, you've got a for next loop where you've got a instance of CLS pet notes. And when you're using the go-to in the middle of the for next loop, rather than exiting it normally, and you're going to the bail, which is, again, another really kind of a poor naming convention, what happens is there's a memory leak that happens because you're not exiting the loop properly. And so this is a really, it's lazy coding to begin with because we can exit a loop very easily, and you will get a memory leak on this. DoEvents, wow. There's only a couple of times to ever use an event loop, and that's for console apps only. There are a few times when they're good for desktop, and never, and maybe never. Although somebody did give me an example where something to do with a modal dialog opening from something else, and you needed the do event for it to actually paint. So there may be one good reason for a do event in a desktop application. But generally, I would say no. This is another common one that I see in a lot of new developers to Xojo. It's like, variant is so easy to use, and it's very powerful. So, hey, why not just use variant for everything? Bad idea, because as you can see from the example here, it depends on how you put it together, on what the value to it previously is. And honestly, I don't know how it came up with the 5.01 value on the second example, because that doesn't even make sense, really. So why use it? I would say use the standard data types whenever possible. Variants are good for tags, things you're putting stuff into, but otherwise you shouldn't have variants in your code. And if you have questions or comments, feel free to raise your hands, and we could get into a good argument about it. I expect this one to be relatively controversial. I believe that you should have the implicit instance on your windows and dialogues and web pages set to false. The implicit instance is really easy to use. I have no problem with it. However, as soon as you access anything, even a property on that window, you've reopened the window, just like that, just by checking something on it. So what you should be doing is looping through the window array to make sure, to see if that window is open. That's the only way of doing it. And at least with the implicit instance, you know exactly when and where that window and dialog and web page are going to get opened. Okay. Yeah. This saying the problem is the implicit instance is true, so turn it to the off position or false. Poor variable names and multiple declarations on one line. Let's start with the second one. The multiple declarations on one line aren't necessarily a problem, other than the fact that it's really easy to get it lost there and you've created a variable that you'll no longer use. Now, if you're checking your project, you can see those and find those. But if you have one on each line, you'll be able to see that easier. So if you're not using it, you'll just see it and get rid of it. The second thing on here is poor variable names. I can take a couple of guesses down here with W2 and H2 and W3, but that's just a guess because they don't really tell me exactly what's going on. And the one after that, where A, T, D, TX, TI, and I have no idea what those are. Maybe I is a loop variable. I don't know. But I think what I would do is special loop variables, never declare them up on top. I declare them as part of the loop. So for I as integer is equal to 1 to 10, use it there rather than declaring it up front. And I also like declaring all my variables inside the loop if they don't go outside the loop. And that way you've got scope control on your variable even inside your own method. Very controversial. I know there are people that like it, everything declared right up on top, but I don't think that's necessarily the best way of doing it. If that's your personal preference, do that. But work on your variable names so that they mean something, so that somebody who's not you or your future self from 6 weeks from now or 6 years from now can look at the code and go, oh yeah, okay, I remember this now. We're resizing a picture here or rotating it or whatever, and these are the variables that I'm using. I'm rotating new width, new height, whatever, and I know what it is. Yes.
So I'm assuming theoretically that using P and I, T, G, whatever, goes back to when memory was a lot more expensive than it is today in most applications. Or it was just shortcuts or what have you, and that for some reason that became sort of the default for a lot of programmers to not use actual useful variable names in the descriptive.
So to summarize that, the question was the use of small variable names due to memory constraints or something else? I will say something else. I think is just because people were lazy. Yeah, I mean, I use I all the time because we all have loops, and I is just the convenient one. And whenever I find myself, I've got a loop on the inside for whatever reason, I always go to I, and then I'm like, I should just use J. And then I go, no, let me take a step back here, because now I've got 2 loop variables. I will actually go back and rename the first one outer loop as integer, so that when I'm looking at it, it's explicitly clear as far as what variable it is. So anytime there's a possibility of confusion, you want to be explicit whenever possible. Right, and the comment was in the old basic days you had 2-letter variables, and I worked on a basic language where you were limited to 6 characters, and if the first and last character were the same, it was considered the same variable. Yeah, it was really strange.
So it was two characters.
Yeah, except this case I guess 3. Yeah, it was an illusion, and unless you do that going into it, it led to all sorts of crazy things. All right, so the next one is tight loops and UI freeze. Now, it's really hard to see from this example, but we've got a progress bar that's set to 10,000, and our loop is set to 10,000, and our process line is some imaginary method that takes a finite amount of time, but it's not very fast. So, a couple of seconds to process, and we're setting the progress bar value to I. Well, because we're in a tight loop, we never allow the event loop to refresh our progress bar. So there are there are 3 things we could do. 2 of them are bad. So one of them is do events, which we've already said that's bad. The second one is we can go progress bar 1.refresh. Not awful, but what happens is you're forcing the UI to refresh through this 10,000 items in this loop, so it's going to be slow. I mean, the process of redrawing is slow. So really, probably the best solution, you can do invalidate, which means whenever the window decides that it needs to refresh, you can do it. But even that's no guarantee on this. So probably the best solution is to throw it inside of a thread and have the thread do the updating, or issue an event to update every now and then. You don't need to update every time through the loop, 10,000 times. I really don't care. Every 10 times through the loop would be more than good enough, right? So think about that when you're designing these loops, because you don't really need to. The user, you've already told the user something's going to take a long time with a progress bar. As long as it updates every now and then, they're going to be happy. So the question was, do you put the invalidate before or after the thing you want to refresh? And I always do it after. Yeah, and the thing with the invalidate is that it still waits for the window to refresh. You're just saying, I'm dirty, it needs to be refreshed. But it may not work in this case because there's no chance for the window events to come in. So the question is, would I ever use a timer? I would much rather use a thread. And I use task threads, and I've got a specialized version where as the thread is going, I realize I need to update the UI. I fire an event on the timer, and there's an example of this in the Xojo examples for I think it's called task thread, so that you can update the main thread, and it just does it when it can. Sure, and the comment was he uses a thread to update the UI. Perfectly acceptable. I don't like using timers to update UI in something that's lengthy like this. I always use a thread because, and if you take a look at the example of the task thread, it fires a timer. Timers always, 100% of the time, fire on the main thread. So if you pass something in that action event back into the main thread, you're fine. And I can show you an example of that afterwards. Okay. Or the comment was, or you can sleep 100 milliseconds. That's so sleeping is cheating, because you really want this to finish as fast as possible. So now all you're doing is slowing it down. You might as well hit refresh at that point.
I already told them that it's going to take a while with progress bar.
Okay, you're right. I've already told them that it's going to take a while. Okay, just don't do it that way. Just use a thread. It solves lots of problems. Yes. Okay, so the question is, why wouldn't you use invalidate? You can use invalidate, but if you're in such a tight loop and it takes so long, your window may not actually get the redraw command. But the point is you want the progress bar to actually update so the user can see it. Not necessarily. If you're in a tight loop, it may not. No, not necessarily. If you're in a tight loop, it may not refresh. Despite what you think, the window may not refresh, and that's the thing, may not. So this, if you put it in a thread, it will always work. If you put it in a refresh, it will always work. It'll slow it down. If you put in a DoEvents, it will always work. But the tight loop is the key. That in a normal loop, you got 10, maybe even 1,000. No big deal. It finishes in no time at all. So it'll just refresh the window when it's done. I mean, I've seen it. Look, I'm not saying you're wrong, but I've had loops where I literally try to make the progress wheel visible, and I go through the loop and I see it blip at the end of the loop, and then it's like, oh, well, I'm now invisible. So I just see it blink, when really I wanted it during this process. So it's easier for me to think of it as I need to put it in a thread. Yes, both of those. The question is what am I trying to do in this loop? Update the do the processing or update the progress bar? And the answer is both. I mean, they're one and the same. If I'm using, I'm sorry, I probably should have done an example of how I would do this in my own thread, but it's the task thread that's in Xojo examples fires, once you say, oh, I want to update the progress bar, it creates a 1 millisecond timer. Actually, it might even be faster than that, I don't know, but it fires it on the main thread, passes the data that it needs to pass, and when it processes it on the main window or on the main thread, then it updates the progress bar. And we can, come see me afterwards and we'll show you what's going on. All right, I'm using AddHandler. Now, AddHandler's been around for a number of years. It's really convenient to have a timer where you just create it in code, and then how do you get the action event? Well, you do an AddHandler. And in this case, we've got a web dialog that we're creating, and we're doing the dismissed event, and we're doing it to a local dialog dismissed method. Well, the one thing that people forget is that you must do a remove handler to pair with that. And if you don't, well, bad things can happen if you try and do an AddHandler again, and even if you don't remember to do, and you don't do that, but you forget the remove handler, there's still some memory that's still hanging around. So it's possible to get some memory leaks. There's an issue where, you could use, this is address of. Some people recommend using a weak address of. It doesn't matter because it's still there. So the weak address of doesn't really protect you at all in this case. Just whenever you do the AddHandler, go into your code, automatically do the remove handler just so that you've got it taken care of. Any questions on that? This one's always a fun one. We worked on a project recently where the developer and client, they wanted me to do some work on it, and they were going to take it over. So they had done some initial work where they had well over 50 text fields, and they repeated the same events in every single one of them. And then they go, hey, I want to add 2 more events to all these. And it was not fun, because the first thing I did is I went and created a subclass of the text field that had the events that they wanted, including the 3 new ones that they wanted. The point of this is that you only want to go to one spot to change behavior of a control unless that one control is the abnormal one. So a subclass of the control will make your life easier. Because imagine implementing, the got focus, lost focus, key down, text changed event in 100 text fields throughout your project, and then realizing, well, maybe we should add another event or change the behavior of it, which means you have to go to every single one of those things to do it. Minimize the amount of code. So be a lazy programmer, combine it all into one subclass if you can, and at that point it's easy, because what you can do is you can do the subclass and then change the super of it, of the ones you're going to do. Well, you're not quite done, because you've now implemented the events in your super class. Now your compiler is complaining, hey, I've already implemented this event, so you'll have to go in and do it. But at least then the compiler tells you where the error is. Of course, if you re-implement the event, then you still have issues, but that's a different story right there. This one is particularly annoying. And if the first thing I do, if I get a project that has text field 1 through 10, sometimes it's up to 99, I've seen that. First thing I do is I go to the UI and I go, what's the label that's right next to it? I go, oh, this is first name. So txt first name, or first name / text, or whatever. I mean, a naming convention that will tell you what that control is so much easier than trying to figure out what text field 2 is in the middle of a module. It says, well, get the text out of text field 2. What does it do? I don't know. So don't use the default control names. We have a whole subset of naming conventions that we use. I don't care which one you use. Just use one that means something to you. Because remember, You're not writing for right now, you're writing for your future self, 6 months, 6 years, maybe 10 years from now, so that you can easily read the code without having to switch back and forth between the UI. Because as soon as I switch the UI, I'm going to forget what I was looking at. Now, I expect this one to be fairly controversial for some people. So, there's code, and in the current existing Xojo framework, there's some of this too, where it's like, okay, so in this case, I'm assigning a constant, which is an integer. ISUM value is formatted text dot display align left. From experience, I know that's a 0, which is fine. And then I'm sending that into set display alignment. Again, makes perfect sense. The problem is the method that it's being sent into is just setting a property, but it's not checking the bounds. What happens if it's -1? What happens if it's 3? There's no checking there. So, and the compiler doesn't help me at all. But, however, if you change this to an enum, I can say that new value is of type formatted text dot display alignment. And then when I set that in there, the compiler, if I try and put an integer in there, the compiler will go, no, that's wrong. It's going to give me a compile error. And now it's definitely, this is what I'm setting in there. And you can see it in the existing framework, a Xojo list box. Your column types are constant, but you can put the number in there if you want. You know, you can put a type 1 in there, and I think that means it's a editable list box, I think, or cell, column type, I don't know. This is why the enums are so nice, because it tells you what it is. And, you know, they're autocomplete, hopefully, most of the time. And so the whole idea is not to be confused ever with what the code is. Now, we can argue all day long about whether or not Xojo does a great job of being able to convert between enums and integers and all that easily, but that's a different story. It's all solvable. Worthless comments. I will give this developer credit. There's a comment on every line, but it mirrors exactly what the code says. If we're in read-only mode, then return. Well, it doesn't say return, but are we in read-only mode? I can tell that from the method name. What's worse is when it got complicated, the comments disappeared and didn't tell me the information that I really needed. So having a comment on every line isn't necessarily wrong, but is it really advantageous? I mean, this is pretty simple code. I don't really need it. But the comments should be there to help you understand the purpose of this code and why we might want to return early. I mean, in this case, you know, we're in read-only, so we're in a change event, so read-only, boom, just exit. The comment should mean something. I mean, don't do commenting for the sake of commenting. Do commenting because you need it. You need it to imply what's going on to, again, your future self from 6 months, 6 years from now, so that, you know, heaven forbid, if they invent a time machine, they don't come back and shoot you. Magic numbers. Can anybody tell me why we're multiplying card width times 0.55? Or why we're doing the wrap width times 0.45? Now, I can sort of guess based on, you know, what's going on, the text size, 14 times ratio dot right divided by 72. I'm suspecting this has something to do with text size, so, you know, but again, I don't know. There's 0 comments in here, so these are magic numbers. The bottom example, we are taking the window position, we're adding 10 to the X position. Why 10? Yeah, why? I mean, was this just, again, it's a magic number, and as much as I hate to admit, this bottom one's actually mine, so. But this is the thing, you know, I think it's very important if we're not looking at our own code and we're not embarrassed by our own code, at least a little bit, come on, you know, let's be honest. You're not learning from your code, you know, you're not trying to get better. I'm embarrassed by this because I don't know why I did 10. I mean, it probably looked fine at the time and I was busy and I just moved on to the next thing. But, you know, it doesn't help any of my employees and it certainly doesn't help me now because I don't know what I did. I expect this one to be another controversial one. If statements that span the entire method. So in this case, we're creating this new class and then we're doing load. And if it's true, then we do a bunch of stuff. And what you're not seeing is this spans 3 full pages of things that are inside this if, and then at the end we go, if it's false, just return. I much rather like this one, where if it's false, I return right away. Now you can't do this with every method, but there are times when this just doesn't make any sense. But I'm a very firm believer that if you're going to fail early and bail. Having it go through the entire method only to say, well, if it failed, return. It doesn't help us. The comment was the blue lines in the latest release help. I disagree, and I'll show you why in a minute. Yes, and we'll talk about that in a second. So multiple things on a single line of code. Again, this code's not wrong. I mean, we've all done it. But the problem is, I want to put a breakpoint in when the MB we are locked is true. Well, the only way to do that is to either add a separate line where I put the breakpoint in there, or I put a carriage return after return true and then put an end in. Either way, I'm changing code just to put a breakpoint in. I mean, the compiler doesn't care if you've got the end in there or not. It just cares that it's a complete statement, and the compiler is going to compile it down to what it needs to. But this makes it hard for me to put a breakpoint in there. Again, this is, if you're doing a couple of thousand of these in a project, maybe it's good, maybe it's not. But for debugging purposes, this makes it hard. And certainly the immediate if that they added was a year ago, 2 years ago, whatever it was. This is horrible because I don't know what that value is, and there's no easy way of seeing what it is unless I put in a debugging variable, which again means I'm changing the code. I would rather write this out longhand so I can see all these things in the debugger and put breakpoints in. I've seen this one a couple of times from people that come from VB6 land, where instead of creating a data class where they've got a date of birth and a user ID and an email and a first name and a last name, they'll create an array for every single one of the properties that they're looking at, and then they'll go, oh, well, okay, I'm at record 5, so everything will be this, with index 5, and then they have to do that for every single property. And it's so complicated, much more complicated than if they had just created a data class and had a single array of that data class. Does anybody understand not understand what I'm saying about that? Okay. Again, the VB6 projects I've converted, if I see this, the first thing I will do is get rid of all of these arrays, combine it into one data class, and have a single array. Yes, Bob?
The data class could be simply a bunch of properties and it could all be public. You just want to gang things together.
Absolutely. The comment was, why not just have a single class and make them public properties and they're all there? And absolutely, that's what I'm saying. Yeah, and the other nice thing about having the data class then is if I want to create a method that says, well, give me the full name of this person, first name space last name, that's just a method on the class, and I just call that, rather than having to create a general method in my window or in another module that says, well, okay, here's my index, so return the full name of this. Again, it's not complicated, but it's easier. I think the whole goal should be we want to be lazy programmers as much as we can. Yeah, and the comment was what's even worse is if you've got want to remove one of these, you have to remove it everywhere, where if you've got the single class, just remove the property, the compiler will give you a warning of wherever you're using it, it's easy to delete. Not handling exceptions. Wow. This one's kind of crazy. I can't believe that here we are in 2019 and applications are still closing down with this dialog. You can still have your application closed down if you've reached an unhandled exception. That might be a good thing depending on on your application. We tend to return true just so it stays running, but what we do is we put up this dialog and it tells you what the exception is, and we have a button that says email the report, which opens up the second dialog, asks them a quick question of what they were doing, and if they try and email it without one, we'll do like, it'd really be nice if you told us what you're doing. But what it does is it packages it up, uses their email system, so it's not using our email system, it's using their email client, gives us the stack trace, gives us any information that we're doing, like what OS are they using, things like that, and whatever else we've put in there, and that way we can get, as developers, can get more information back out of it. I wouldn't let an application just quit without trying to capture information of why. As a developer, we should be able to get that information so that we can actually fix stuff. Okay. And if people are looking for this class and all that, I can make it available. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but Kem's class this morning talked a little bit talked quite a bit about encoding. If everything in your application, your file, your database is coming from your application, you know what the encoding is. The default is UTF-8, but anything that's coming from outside, you don't know what it is. So you're going to have to check the encoding, define the encoding, or change the encoding into what you want. And it's not very hard to do, but certainly anytime the database is tied to other services, the file could be modified by somebody else, you're receiving information via TCP socket or from the web, you should really check the encoding. Yes? Right, so the comment was the new URL connection will force that, and that's correct. Everything in the new Xojo framework definitely defines the encoding. There are still parts of the existing framework that don't do that. With API 2.0, I definitely expect all that to happen for us, and it'll just be kind of crazy until we do that, until that all works its way in. And if you weren't at Kem's session, I highly recommend watching it on video, and it was a really good session. I learned some things about encoding and even had to Google something while he was doing it. I'm like, yeah, okay, yeah, he's right. So, so loading too much data into UI controls. Man, trying to load 10,000 rows into a desktop list box is bad. I mean, it can be done, but it's slow, and the users, once you have that much data in a list box, sometimes it's really hard to scroll through that and pick the ones you want. What we've done in the past is we've done paging of data, and we've all seen this where, especially web pages will do this, where it's like, we're only going to show you 50 or 100 records at a time, and you just create a control, and you just go click on the next, and it just keeps loading. This is easy with the database using index and, I'm drawing a complete blank. What's that? Yes, limit and the index. So you can say, I want page or index, whatever it is. I forget, I didn't write it in the notes. So, but it's easy enough to do, and a lot of databases do this. And when it gets to the web, it's gonna even be worse, because trying to put 10,000 rows in a web list box, might as well go get a drink and go use the bathroom before you come back, and it'll finally load. Now, with all this said, obviously Web 2.0, there's going to be data on demand list box, so this won't be as big an issue. I would still kind of maintain that having 10,000 rows in a list box is a bad UI choice, but there are times when that's a good choice and the only choice. I think Graffiti Suite, their web list box, has data on demand, and PyDog's data view for desktop has data on demand as well. So So if you think that you're going to be doing with that much data, or if you need specialized cells and things like that in your list box, those might be good alternatives to the standard list boxes. So, oh yeah, pop-up menus. I hate pop-up menus that take up the entire screen and then you still end up scrolling. I think from a UI perspective, I'd much rather create a dialog with a list box and a search capability, so that, you know, maybe it's a little easier to find this data. Pop-up menus, really, you know, if it's scrolling past the size of your screen, that's too much data. And certainly that's one issue that we find out when we're starting off development. You know, we only have 10 choices, so pop-up menus are a great idea. And then it gets to the client, and you see, you know, two years later, they've got 1,000 choices in there. And, you know, so they're just used to holding it down. It's like, all right, we're finally there, and then they'll pick it. Well, that's bad UI design. But we just didn't know it at the time because no one told us that they were going to have 1,000 choices. Big methods are bad. My own personal preference is that any method that can scroll twice on the screen is too big. I generally try and make it just one screen, but, you know, obviously laptop sizes are a little different. But on my big monitor at home, if I can fit everything on one screen, that's best. If it is that much bigger, I will often take especially like with a select case statement, I will take the case and I will actually make a method called case blah and make that a method so that it works on all that data in that method. The other advantage of that is if you've got a huge method and you have an exception, where do you know where it was? A no object exception in a 1,000-line method could be any number of things. But if a no object exception in 10 lines of code, you've got a good shot of being able to figure out what it is. Here's an example that a Xojo engineer told me. In a window open event, there was over 10,000 lines of code with dozens of loops, if-then statements. They used DoEvents to make sure that the window redrew, and they used go-tos so that it was always working. And then they complained that the compiler didn't work right. So, you know, you can take this to the extreme. Big methods, bad. We talked a little bit about this earlier, and this is not a great example. I couldn't find one in my current projects that was over 4, so I took the one that was the biggest. And, you know, so yes, the code folding, the lines, make it helpful to figure out what it is, but here I am in the middle of a method, and I've got at least 3 loops that I can't tell what they are from this screenshot, and I've got an else, but I don't know what the else is. So you can say that there's bad commenting in here because I don't know what the else is for in this case. I'd have to assume that the CLS history didn't exist, so we're just creating a new one. But I don't know because there was no comments. And so every time you do these, you know, do a loop, you're indenting a little bit more, and it makes it more complicated just to see what it is. Again, this kind of goes back to the big methods. I don't like this because it makes it more complicated. Code folding is nice, but it's not perfect, and I don't know, maybe I'm just an old curmudgeon developer, but I just don't like code folding. It just doesn't do much for me. So, oh, thank you. The comment was Bruno agrees. So therefore, I am validated. Circular references. This one we talk about all the time, but what does it really mean? Well, what you're doing is object A makes a reference to object B. Object B makes a reference to object A. Now, unless you're really careful with how you destroy your object A and B, your reference count for those objects will not go back to 0 because they need to be nulled out. So therefore, you'll get a memory leak, and the memory will just keep building until finally your machine can't handle it anymore, and it'll just go poof. So one of the ways of getting around this is making sure your destructors null your references to other objects and use a weak reference instead. And that will at least the compiler knows how to deal with that. This one's a big one in my book. I've had 3 projects in the last 6 months that have all done this, where the serial device, or where the serial device, in this case a barcode scanner, was used as a keyboard. Now, in many events, perfectly fine, except these events all use the keyboard in addition to the barcode reader. So how do I know if the event that I'm about ready to get, or the text event, the text changed event, or the key down event, is a real user, or is it a barcode reader? Now, you can do some funny stuff like timing and things like that, but still, what if I'm in the middle of a keyboard event, or middle of a barcode scan, and the user hits the keyboard at the same time? It's possible. I mean, you'd have to be really quick, but it's possible. I have yet to meet a barcode reader that, I mean, the default is to act like a keyboard. I've never met one that couldn't be used as a serial device, both on Mac and Windows. It becomes so much easier because you know exactly where it's coming from. You could have multiple barcode readers. There's nothing fancy you have to do. And the code is piece of cake. And I've had arguments with people like, well, the keyboard, acting as a keyboard is just fine. Like, yeah, for your application it was. So I would say don't do it unless you absolutely have to. You know, the ability to read data off of a serial port is pretty easy. So now we'll get into database mistakes, and frankly, these are the kind of the bigger ones in my opinion. Record set is nil. You know, how many times have we seen developers do, you know, they do SQL select, and then they go, well, if the record set's other than nil, then we'll take care of it. Well, what does a nil record set mean? It means there was an error. It means something went wrong with your SQL statement. It won't be that your database is nil because your database is already, I mean, it made it past that line. So there was something that went wrong. Ideally, what you really want to do is you want to go, if the database error happens, now do something. Document it, and then return, because obviously nothing else after that's going to work all right. You need to do this after SQL select, SQL execute. You can do this after a database connect. I think you can do this after prepare. You can do this, you should do this after a begin transaction, because that, you know, you can't, in many databases, you can't do nested transactions. So you need to do, anytime you have the possibility of changing data or doing something with the database, check for the error code. Now, obviously we learned yesterday that in API 2.0, the database is going to be changed, so this will throw an exception. So next time, it'll be you'll have to put a try-catch block around it. But I'm wondering how many people will get screwed up with that even then. So don't do it. Do it the right way. So I have a family member whose last name is O'Neill, so I call this the O'Neill factor. In which case, you know, if I put in O'Neill as in a text field, it should just handle it. So the easy way of doing this is using prepared statements, and it lets you format for the other data types. It doesn't care if it's string. Well, you do care. You have to tell it if it's going to be a string or a number, and it just formats the string properly for you. It's also a huge security thing where it prevents SQL injection attacks. These are all things that are really good that you need to do, especially with your web apps, but desktop apps are a good idea too. And it's much safer, and you know, it's not terribly slower. If anything, API 2.0 is probably going to be a little faster because you don't have to do the bind type first. It just kind of does it based on the data type. But again, this is going away in API 2.0. It'll just be there. So if you're using iOS right now, you'll understand that that's the way they're going. Anybody have questions on the prepared statements? Okay, good. Not using transactions. Oh my gosh, how do I even begin on this one? So I did a blog post a couple months ago where I did a SQLite statement. I inserted 10,000 rows of data. Not very much data, but 10,000 rows, that's not a lot. And it took 38, 39 seconds to do that. Do that same thing inside of a transaction, It takes a second. As a matter of fact, it was faster than a second. It came back as 0. So significant time savings with using transactions. And it's essentially what it's doing is it's creating a temporary state for the database to go, until you commit, it can go, I can roll back at any time. And when you have things like parent-child records, where like you have an invoice and an invoice line items, you would save the invoice header and then start saving the line items. And if there's an error, you could have 10,000 line items for an invoice, and if it's 9,999 invoice item that's errors out, for some reason, doesn't matter what it is, you can just do a rollback, and it's like it never happened. Which is nice because you can't just insert that data willy-nilly. Like in an accounting application, you could really mess up account balances if you're not doing a transaction, because on that invoice, every single one of those line items is affecting multiple accounts. So as you're changing the accounts because of the line items, you're changing account balances. Well, good luck getting those account balances back unless you're in a transaction. So the transaction is very safe and highly recommended. And if you're not doing that with parent-child records, you should be. And it's really the only way to recover from a DB error. And again, you have to check for the database error after every transaction. So every insert, every parent insert, every child insert, every parent update, child update, you should be checking for that error. Any questions on transactions? Looping record sets. Now, there are legitimate reasons to do a looping record set. But there's probably a better way of doing it. So in this case, we're doing a record set RS, we're selecting star from a table. And then we're doing a second query inside of that where we're getting from B table, where the table ID is equal to some field data from the first record set. We're doing an edit, we're doing an update. This is really bad. This is really slow, and you really should do all this work in the database itself. You can probably do this with one SQL statement. And I realize sometimes that coming up with this stuff isn't always easy, but whenever you're doing the looping record set, there's probably an easier way of doing it. It involves knowing a little bit of SQL sometimes, and maybe playing around with the database until you get it right. But hopefully, you're proficient with databases, or you have a database goddess on staff that can help you out, which I use more often than figuring it out myself. So not using database views. Views are your friends. In the previous example, we were using looping record sets, and it was getting data. Well, you can use a view to combine all that data into one table-like structure that's read-only. Or at least most databases are read-only on their views. There are views, some databases where views can be updated. I'm not sure any of those work with Xojo real well, but we'll do that. I think that's something that you should think of. If you're combining the data from more than one table, or 3 or 4 or 5, that's a really nice, simple way of doing it. Now, the drawbacks with views are views are not updatable. Like I said, they're sometimes slow because that depends on the database to combine all this data together, and depending on how the joins work and what all you're doing, they can be slow. And there are ways of getting around that, but it's not always very easy. And they're not always easy to create because it involves doing joins and inner joins and outer joins and sometimes concatenation of queries and things like that. So GUI editors are helpful, and certainly there's been more than a few questions on the Xojo forums about stuff like that. So in our development phase, generally what we do is, here's our list, we're going to add, we're going to edit, we're going to delete. Maybe we'll do this 3 or 4 times to make sure our sorting works on our list boxes, and then we go to the production phase where the client adds millions of rows. And what happens? Well, we have slow queries, inserts, updates, and there are a couple of solutions, but one of them is to use indexes on the most commonly queried fields. Limit the usage of likes. Likes are incredibly expensive when it comes to database operations. And when it comes to inserts, use database transactions. This one is particularly annoying. You create like a user table, and you have name, email, and phone, address, and then somebody goes, hey, how do I put my cell phone in there? So you go, well, we'll just do phone 2 or phone cell or whatever. Same thing with address and email. I mean, anytime you're doing field X, that's wrong. At this point, normalization rules say you really should create a separate table for emails, phone numbers, email addresses, things like that, and then point back to that table. So you have an email table that has a user ID in it, or maybe it's a parent ID type and a parent ID, but Carol talked a little bit about that yesterday, so that's a really bad thing to do. Combining data into a single field is probably even worse because now I've got to take every instance where I was expecting a single email address, and I have to go, well, do I have a JSON string or do I have just one? And then if they add another one, well, now I've got to change the data. And believe it or not, I've seen this happen before. The guilty culprit is not in this room, so thankfully. But bad idea. So create a separate table for these things. You can have as many emails as you want then. So, I don't know about the rest of you. I have 6 emails that I go through. I don't want email 1 through 6 in my table. I just want an email table so that I can go, what are Bob's email addresses? And it gives me all of them. And here's a normalized email table, and I won't get too involved with that. So human readable, changeable primary keys. Name is not an acceptable primary key. And so because names change and ID numbers get put in wrong, social security numbers get put in wrong, don't do it. Databases are really good at doing primary keys all on their own. You can make it a unique key so that there's only one Bob Keeney. That's cool. There should only be one Bob Keeney. Yeah, and sometimes it's more than enough. So kind of in that same light, managing your own record IDs, don't do it. Databases are really good at creating primary keys. You are not smarter than the database ever. I guarantee it. Let the DB do what it's good at. Never a good reason to do it. Whether that be a UUID, GUID, or integer primary key, then let the database do that. All right, I ran out of time, so I've got more of them. I'll be happy to go with you. These are all kind of ID things. One big thing, buying encrypted source code. I say don't do it. Get the unencrypted source code because it's future-proof, because you'll always be able to go in and change it if you want. Code signing, you should do it. Mac, Windows. I don't know about Linux. I haven't done enough on that. So, any questions while I'm scrolling through to the end? Make sure you're using the source code management and you're backing up your software. Test on all your targets early and often. While we're doing this, questions. Oh, come on, there's got to be a question somewhere.
We asked all the way along, that's why you're late.
No, I just had too many slides. And I cut it down from 80, okay? So, yes. Do I have any opinions about kubesql as a server? It's a fine database server. The nice thing about it has very low maintenance. It's very easy for people to set up and install and maintain and all that. And because it's SQLite databases, individual databases, it's easy to pull out and use in an editor. Okay, Bob's using it. It's working fine. Yeah, I don't know enough about the tools that are available. So, but talk to Bob since he's been using it, and somebody else said that they were using it too. So. order. So the question was, how do you handle with multiple ID, like multiple emails that somebody would have, and they're broken out into a separate table? Well, there'd be a primary key, which is going to be unique for that row, always unique, and then there will be a foreign key for the user, and then there might be a user type, based on, oh, this is primary phone, this is cell phone, and there might even be like an order by field. So you can move them up and down the list and go, when you list them, it's like, just list them by this order. Yes, we can manage that one. All right, well, thank you very much, everybody.